Welcome back. So in these slides, we're going to be talking through the ideas of another 20th century philosopher, Frantz Fanon. Fanon dealt with some problems different from those of a lot of the philosophers we've read in the course. We've mostly focused on epistemology and metaphysics, and while Fanon does touch on some issues in epistemology and metaphysics, he's primarily concerned with some political problems and what you could call some existential problems. So Fanon was friends with a prominent French philosopher and existentialist named Jean-Paul Sartre. He was inspired by the existentialists. Remember that the existentialists were concerned with problems that emerge, deep problems that emerge in individual experience, in the course of, say, an individual life, and tensions that they face about what to do or how to think about reality. And Fanon can very much be read as a participant in that tradition. At least the book we're reading passages from, Black Skin, White Masks, can be read as a contribution to existentialism. His later writing, The Wretched of the Earth, is the most famous book from his later writing, focuses much more on kind of political strategy, and could be called, probably classified better as political philosophy. He was inspired in that later book by the African liberation struggles, some of which he participated in himself. And he was trying to provide a kind of guidance for the African independence movement, certain kinds of guidance, kind of intellectual guidance, and a kind of framework of intellectual support for the African independence movement, because it was, for one thing, the African independence movement was still was something of a controversial movement in France at the time, for instance. And so part of what Fanon wanted to do was convince French intellectuals that they ought to support the African independence movements, and why they should. And so that's part of what The Wretched of the Earth is intended to do, as well as to provide some guidance to people who are actually involved in the African independence movements, the anti-colonialist movements, about how to conduct their struggles. So a little bit about Fanon's background. Fanon was born in a French Caribbean colony, Martinique. He sometimes refers to the French Caribbean as the Antilles. He fought for the French army in World War II. He studied medicine and psychology in France after the war. And he was his official background is in medicine and psychology, but it's very clear from almost everything that he writes that he's steeped in knowledge of philosophy. He's a very deep and long-time reader of philosophy, and, as I mentioned before, a friend of Jean-Paul Sartre. So he is his writings are very easily classified as philosophy, partly because he's engaged in that longer tradition of debate with people within the larger Western philosophical tradition. He was stationed in Algeria, which was then a French colony in North Africa, after he completed his degree in medicine and psychology. He went to Algeria, where he worked as a physician and as a psychologist. And there, Algeria is in North Africa. He became involved in the African independence movement and attended meetings and wrote for underground newspapers. And you can, he has many essays written for those papers, and you can find them in other volumes besides those mentioned on the slide here. There are some collections of essays that have been published too. His views influenced Malcolm X, Angela Davis, the Black Panthers, anti-colonial movements around the world, not just about anti-Black racism, but about other kinds of colonial situations, and again, anti-colonialist and independence movements. And he influenced critical race theory, as it's called, which has been a topic of debate, or I should say a topic of controversy in the news recently. You may find that interesting, that we're reading and thinking about in our philosophy course one of the founding voices, or one of the kind of leading voices or early leading voices in what today is called critical race theory. And you don't have to agree with it. It's a controversial thing, but just like you don't have to agree with Descartes or with Hume, we'll read it, we'll think about it, and part of the value of philosophy is reading ideas that you don't necessarily agree with, and you can think about why you agree or disagree with them. So the book that we're reading this chapter from is called Black Skin, White Masks. It's an analysis of the black-white racial dynamics as Fanon experienced them. It was published in 1952. It is supposed to be a kind of diagnosis with a little bit of a kind of pointing to a solution, but most of it is diagnostic, as in it's trying to lay out how does racism work, and by analyzing it, by sort of trying to use the tools of philosophy to get as analytically clear as possible about exactly what the dynamics are of white-black racial dynamics. There are a couple ways of describing this. You can describe it as anti-black racism. You can describe it as pathological black-white racial dynamics. Pathological meaning sick or unhealthy. So you can describe it in a number of different ways, and I will describe it in different ways as we go through the lectures on this. But Fanon said he's seeking to analyze this in order to destroy it. Okay, so what he wants to do, he sees there's a huge problem here. There's a problem that people live through. Human beings, white and black human beings, and other human beings that don't clearly fit into either of those categories, still find themselves in that dynamic. They find themselves in a kind of polarity. They find themselves placed on this spectrum between the light and the dark. This dynamic, Fanon thinks, is extremely destructive, extremely oppressive, and he wants to analyze it in order to pick it apart, dismantle it, and have it no longer damage us. That is, no longer damage any of us, white, black, anybody, just to pull it apart so that it can no longer cut and crush human beings as it has been for so long. Now, that's a very tall order. That's a big project for a book, okay? But Fanon does a pretty amazing job of analyzing different dimensions of this black-white racial dynamic. And as I mentioned before, it falls into the genre philosophically of existentialism, that is an analysis of problems as they emerge in an individual person's lived experience. But it also can be classified as a kind of phenomenology, that is a very close analysis and picking apart of dimensions of experience. It's a kind of phenomenology of the experience of racism. It's the experience of racism for someone who's an object or target or a victim of racism. Okay, so a lot going on, but and phenomenology and existentialism are closely connected historically and methodologically. The name of the chapter that we're reading is called The Experience of the Black. It's Expérience vécue in French, which means lived experience. And this is a phrase that comes up in Merleau-Ponty, famous phenomenologist, who had emphasized the phenomenology of the body. That is the way that our experience of our bodies affects, or is a part of, I should say, our experience of our bodies is a part of, a crucial part of, a foundational part of our experience of everything else. And so there's a little bit of a reference here to the phenomenological tradition and in just the title of the chapter. What the chapter is going to do is explore a range of attempts to deal with white-black racial dynamics from the first-person perspective of a black person at the time. broadly Fanon. It's kind of put in like an autobiographical way, but it could be anybody who's confronting it. And the sort of two main things to keep track of in the chapter. I mean, there are a lot of great insights in the chapter, but the two main things to keep track of are the way that racism manifests. There are so many different ways that racism manifests that are tracked in the chapter. So there's a kind of analysis, a kind of breakdown of types of racism or ways that racism can be expressed. And then there's a breakdown of a Black individual's attempt to get beyond those, or to somehow confront those, or sort of beat the racist at this game of the Black-white dynamics. And sadly, I don't know if I want to say the attempts fail, and Fanon knows they fail. By the end of the chapter, he says he's crying. He's up against something that he as an individual is not going to be able to overcome or defeat. And this leads actually in his later writings, such as The Wretched of the Earth, leads him to the conclusion that that we can't actually confront it just individually. We have to confront it. We have to confront it societally, and we have to confront it through revolution, which is actually what he was contributing to with The Wretched of the Earth. So there's actually a very famous argument in favor of justified political violence in The Wretched of the Earth, which is a controversial argument, but a very influential one, particularly in cases where violence is necessary to achieve some kind of freedom, or to achieve freedom from oppression. It seems like there's a good case to be made that it's justified. So that's part of what he gets into in The Wretched of the Earth. But here he's just describing, essentially, he's describing the problem from the standpoint of an individual person's attempt to solve it or relate to it in a way that resolves it, and the failures of that, of all of those different moves. So these are the two things to keep track of here. How does racism operate, all the different ways, and how does one who is a victim of racism try to address it or confront it, and why do those ways not ultimately work?